Then we have Matthias Dill, the CEO of Energy Impact Partners. Then Rebecca Fisher, Associate Director at Climate Works. And then we have Peter Matthew from EY. So I'll hand over the mic. You can introduce yourself.
Good morning to everyone. You've just promoted me since my father's chairman of the group, but as vice chair, my focus is new energy and new transportation, where I lead a vertical on that. We have a company called Sun Mobility, which is using the battery swap methodology on all shared formats. So three-wheelers, two-wheelers, buses across India, partnered with people like Uber and the largest oil company in that country, expanding globally now. Separately and distinctly, I'm managing trustee of a family foundation that is the oldest foundation out of my country, India, focusing on climate change since Rio in '92, so it's almost 30 years. And there I'm climate advisor to a group of 45 of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds and sub-sovereign funds. And our focus is entirely now on looking at transportation financing. Thank you.
So good morning, everybody. I'm Isobel Sheldon. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for Britishvolt, which is a cell development and manufacturing company that's been set up about 18 months ago. We're already in construction with our facility in the Northeast. So one of two facilities in Europe that's actually under construction today. The rest are PowerPoint slides, so we're way out in front. But we're planning 38 gigawatt hours worth of manufacturing capacity in the northeast of the UK. And we've also recently announced a larger facility about double the size in Bécancour in Canada. And we have further global expansion plans beyond that. A little bit about my history. I've been in the battery electric vehicle battery business for 20 years. I was one of the first people to put lithium ion cells into cars and actually run them around on the road. So every time you see an electric vehicle, there's a little bit of my pioneering work in some of the systems and control systems and designs that are in every EV today. But also spent time in industry. So I have my own startup business, but worked for Ricardo as a global battery specialist and worked for Johnson Matthey as their engineering technology director for their battery systems business. And then I was also one of the executive team that set up the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre in Coventry, which is the scale-up facility that was government funded before coming across to set up a real facility for ourselves with Britishvolt. So really nice to see you this morning.
Thank you, Naeem. Thanks for inviting us. It's great to be here this morning. My name is Matthias Dill. I am a managing partner at Energy Impact Partners. And Energy Impact Partners is a global investment platform. We invest in startups in the broader energy transition, roughly 2 billion under management globally. And I think we do believe in two things that are very important and close to our heart. First thing is technology. Second thing is entrepreneurship. But we think those two things combined in the energy transition really have the power to solve the climate crisis. So our heroes are startup founders, people that build great companies using new technologies and really make the breakthrough changes that we need to get to net zero carbon.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rebecca Fisher. I'm an associate director for road transport at Climate Works Foundation. We're a philanthropy that receives funding from multiple different philanthropies and family foundations and invest that in climate mitigation work. My area of expertise is on road transport and the zero emission transportation system. And some of the things that we do is find exciting new opportunities that could use a little bit of grant resources, which is predominantly what we give out, to catalyze additional scale and big announcements. And one of the things that we helped support was an announcement that's happening today with multiple different countries. I think over 100 countries, OEMs and businesses announcing that they're going to commit to 100% zero emission sales by 2035 in leading markets and 2040 across their entire business model. So those are the type of announcements that we support, that we help bring funding to. And we acknowledge that we don't do the hard work, we're just giving out money. So we really do want to highlight the work of our partners, and I'll try to do that to the best of my ability today on this panel. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. So morning, everybody. My name is Peter Matthews. I head EY's Advanced Manufacturing and Mobility business, which is 5 subsectors, all of which are affected by energy transition. So aerospace and defense, industrials, chemicals, automotive, and transportation. So all clearly are right in the heart of the storm of this. We work right the way across those sectors on energy transition. And I think it's a fabulous job. Of course, I'm biased, but I do think it's a fabulous job. We get to meet some great people, all of whom are trying to do really important stuff. And the range, I think, is very significant. It ranges from big businesses who are seeing huge changes in their business models, who have to adapt. They're coming under pressure from the investment community to adapt. And they've got to pivot their businesses, and that's really hard, to working with really interesting new entrants in the market who see an opportunity, who perhaps aren't encumbered by the legacy of a traditional big business and are trying to do really interesting things. And we try and bring them together along with people from the financial world to try and make sure that there's an ecosystem building. So fascinating area, and delighted to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let's kick this conversation out and start. And the first question I have is, let's keep it very broad. How can we accelerate zero emission mobility? 25% of the world's GHG emissions come from transport-based activities. So we have a lot of brain power here. So let's kick this off. Uday.
You've started, of course, with the most important question. Look, it's a convergence, is it not, of technology, finance, industrial manufacturing, and government coming all together. I mean, the key is collaboration. We've heard it again and again. This is not a fragmented, mature industry. It's about everyone coming together. And clearly, there are great examples that I think all of us would have on both the technology trajectory and the finance trajectory that can enable this revolution. And I'm happy to talk more about that later.
I totally agree with you, Uday, and I think that up until fairly recently, we've had some grand ambitions and some great plans to rid the world of carbon and create a better environment. But you need something beyond that headline. You need a delivery pathway to be able to achieve that, and that really does tie in the elements that you're talking about there. It's no good just for government to say, we have to do this and out to industry just to get on with it. The support functions need to be there to make sure that we can deliver technology in a timely fashion to actually make a difference, rather than just leaving it completely up to the market to decide, because we'll end up with a whole different set of problems if we do that.
Thanks. Naeem, if I can just pick a subset of your question, I'd love to pick the passenger transport. I think that's, for me, the most exciting part today, because that is more or less solved on a high-level technical level, right? Battery electric vehicles are working at scale, give good consumer experiences, large range of cars on the road. So that's, like, on high level, that's solved. But it now starts with a very interesting piece of very small but relevant problems, right? Because how do you charge your car to make sure you're not using coal power from the grid at a given point in time? So there's lots of very small problems we have to tackle. They might not be good for headlines, but I think they're important to tackle. And I think the way to tackle them is really use smart technologies, small pieces, different types of technologies, and get them to scale. And I think that what we believe as a platform is that those technologies can only scale if, like, the small startups work together with the incumbent part of the industry, right? The small startups should work with the big auto OEMs, with the big oil and gas companies, with the big utilities. And I think that matchmaking isn't always easy, but I think if we get that right, I think we're in a good spot.
So at ClimateWorks, we have kind of this theory of change, which involves kind of three components. The first is ambitious government policies to forward the ZEV transition, supported by business leadership, businesses stepping up saying, we will go with you, government, and really put forward not only our money, but also our actions to invest in zero emission vehicles for ourselves and our entire supply chain. And all of that is supported by people power, robust, kind of funded and diverse people coalitions that I think are key to kind of underpinning not only this transition, but in a just transition pathway. And I think those are the three key areas that we direct our funding in, and that are key to making sure that this is a transition that happens quickly enough and in a way that involves everyone and not just the some.
So the joy of going last is that most of the good points have already been made. But let me just build on what Rebecca said a little bit. I think a lot of what we spend our time focusing about is who's actually going to pay. So ultimately, there can only be three people who pay: the consumer, government, or the businesses themselves. And I think what we think it'll have to be a balance but actually government intervention becomes really important. And I think if you look at adoption, if I just stay in EVs for the moment, just pure EVs, the data is really clear. If you put really good incentives, you will get much better EV take-up. And I think that's one really important area. I think the other thing, and we can all help in this, is just helping consumers transition their attitudes. So all of us in this room have lived through what's happened with diesel. So, 15, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have blinked about buying a diesel car. And now we are at a situation where I think the latest numbers, diesel was certainly well under 10% of all cars sold in the UK. And you go, well, that's extraordinary. That's an extraordinary change. But actually, really, that's been done by a combination of government and public sentiment. So repeatedly extolling the virtues and the consequences of not making the transition, I think become very important, because ultimately it's the consumer who will decide what type of mobility they choose.
That's a great point, Peter. Here at Wood, we look at what's driving the decarbonization pathways to zero, and consumer behavior is very important. And this sort of build back greener or build back better hashtags are being actually seen in EV purchases around the world. We're seeing the highest uptakes in EV purchases this year in many countries across Europe, as well as back where I'm from, Canada. We're making great and bold ambitions in this space. So I think one of my next questions to the panel is, let's talk about some of those challenges. And what I want to do is we've got different perspectives here. So what are the challenges you're seeing around the world, in particular the differences that you're seeing in terms of emerging and developed economies? So why don't we start with Rebecca? You have the mic.
Great, thanks. So in my little three-part theory of change, I started with government policies. And in the global south, I think that government policies are so important, but that has to go alongside a capacity building and an increased kind of support for government enforcement of those policies. And that's not always the case. So when you're working in when we work in developing economies, we not only help support ZEV policies, but we also support generally governments working to better enforce all regulations. And that's usually goes hand in hand with a robust and strong civil society network that holds governments accountable. And I think one of the biggest barriers, if you think about a ZEV regulation, is again enforcement of that. So in developing economies, we focus on the civil society kind of support, but also in businesses pushing innovation and really kind of showing that it's possible. There's sometimes a lack of ambition because there's a unstable electric grid. So why would we plug a car into it when we could just drive around in a gas-powered vehicle? And that's and that is a narrative that we want to stop perpetuating. ZEVs are ready for the global south. The global south is ready for ZEVs, and we see it time and time again. E-buses in Latin America are taking off. I think Colombia just announced or Chile just announced a ZEV goal. This is happening in the global south almost faster than it is in the global north. And that's, I think, something that Matthias wants to talk about.
Go ahead. No, you made a great point, because I think conceptually electric vehicles are just better products. And I think there is no point in going through the kind of trajectory in developing countries doing internal combustion engine first and then electric. They can just leapfrog right into electric vehicles. And that's what I think is very exciting. It's maybe an analogy if you look at like how telecommunication has evolved, right? It just leapfrogged into mobile networks as opposed to like cables on the ground. So I'm very optimistic that actually the developing countries might develop faster than we think, and maybe than some of us in the Western world, where we have quite a legacy of technologies that we got used to. So not sure if that's the same.
So I'm really pleased that we're staying on electric vehicles, because that's the area of speciality I have. But I think this increase in electrification that we're seeing comes with a health warning. So we all know, to quote Boris, we need to build back better. But the question is, build back better from where? Because we don't have the metrology and the accounting methods in place at the moment to allow consumers to make informed decisions. So when you walk into a car showroom and you buy an electric vehicle, you look at the sticker, there's no information to tell you where it was built. There's no information to tell you which area of the world the components were mined and refined and converted into materials. So you have no idea of the embedded carbon content and the ethics that went into making that vehicle. And I think we need to get to a place where people are much better informed to make sure they're making the correct decision. Not just the headline, I've got a zero emissions vehicle, but looking at the embedded carbon that's in that vehicle too. I think it's really, really important. Otherwise, we're going to build a problem for the future.
Peter, I don't want you to go last in this question. Go ahead and then we'll get OD.
Yes, so I mean, I'll focus my comments on infrastructure, because I think that range anxiety will be replaced by charge anxiety. And all of us are used to driving internal combustion engines, and some of the ranges on those internal combustion engine cars, certainly if you're old enough to be my age, they really weren't very good. So you didn't worry because you knew there would be a filling station at some stage. So for me, it's about driving the infrastructure. And I think that has to be a public-private partnership. But if you look at China, where clearly a lot of it will be done by the government, that will absolutely drive out the infrastructure. And the fact that that'll drive out the infrastructure will take away any nervousness in the consumer's minds, because they'll know they'll always be very close to a charging point. And I am a great believer that technology will advance really, really quickly. Battery ranges will get quicker and quicker. Charging times will get, slower and slower in terms of, it's not going to be I've got to wait 45 minutes. It'll be 15, 10. It'll go down. You might get inductive charging as well. So I think the challenge is going to be, can you build that infrastructure out? And that will determine the pace of adoption, I think.
When we talk about the global south, why don't we take a case study? India is the third largest carbon emitter in the world. It'll end up being the second. And it's one of the largest transportation markets in the world. For example, it is the largest two-wheel transportation market in the world, including China. Some of the questions we've discussed in the last 5 minutes are extraordinarily relevant, but slightly differently applied in that context. What does consumer choice mean? It means something very different. So as you think about the Indian middle class, it's not the middle class of Europe. And as that middle class emerges, range anxiety is an issue, charge time is an issue, the availability of infrastructure obviously is an issue, but the most important issue by far is affordability. And even as we hit these TCO curves, wherein TCO overall is getting to parity, sticker price really matters. And those battery as a service models that are in traditional formats may not fully yet work. Therefore, the point that was made about technology innovation is really important. My partner is a person called Chetan Maini. You might remember those small cars that are still on the streets of the UK called the G-Whizzes. He came up with that out of India 10, 15 years ago. And when I met him a few years ago, I said, what's the breakthrough idea here? He said, look, the biggest problem is the price of the battery, which creates a very high sticker price up front for the vehicle. And I've spent years now thinking about it. There is only one solution I can think of to deal with this. And that is something that became a little bit unfashionable because of one particular company 10 years ago, and that's battery swapping. And so what he and we have done together in India is by removing the battery from the vehicle, ensured that the vehicle price is now well below upfront the price of a diesel or petroleum vehicle. But arbitraging the cost of a petroleum atom and a power electron, we can get a decent return on providing the swapping service. And we partnered with the largest oil company, with Uber, and with many other people to roll this out on a very large basis. Now, this is leading to upfront and over time a price and a cost which is much lower than diesel and petroleum for the first time. And that is a model we're taking across the developing world. So it also solves the issue of infrastructure. So it's very relevant what was said about infrastructure, but we're taking a different approach. So we have these tiny, small Coke vending machines, and the vending machines can go in every corner shop. You can plug them into the wall, which means that the existing power grid can handle, at least to a certain point, the kind of a market-based solution to putting these swapping stations everywhere. The bus depots are different. We use robots, and that then needs a power line installed. But it's changing everything when we take that bottoms-up view of how to solve a problem in an emerging country on the ground. Thank you.
Just add something to that. I think it's really interesting because the emerging economies have a very, very different challenge because you haven't got mature markets in certain ways. So we're not seeing battery swap as being something that's going to be adopted in Europe because Europe is a highly competitive automotive sort of, well, very premium-led automotive sector. So the automotive industry can't compete with each other effectively if they're all using the same battery, which is a fundamental problem. You're going to have differentiation in those market performance requirements. And one of the things that's going to happen over here is you've got the headline range problem that everybody's trying to combat. We need range as high as possible because we've got range anxiety because the charging infrastructure isn't there. Once that charging infrastructure matures and you've got a more dependable and accessible charging infrastructure, what you'll see over the long term is the battery electric vehicle market in Europe maturing, and it will become less about range over time. And that's where you have the opportunity to have shorter battery ranges, shorter battery sizes, lower cost batteries, better price accessibility into the market because you've got the charging infrastructure to support the shorter range vehicles, which is so much of a problem at the moment.
Can I just add something too? When we're speaking about the global south and the electrification pathway for transportation, I think we focused a lot of our discussion on passenger vehicles and a bit on 2- and 3-wheelers, but we cannot forget about public transit, buses and e-buses and e-bikes as well. It's going to take electrifying the full suite of transportation options to really electrify our entire mode of moving around and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And so I think, you know, I just want to make sure that we don't end our discussion today without mentioning e-buses and e-bikes and all ranges of mobility, because it's going to, everyone needs has a different use case. You're going to need an E something for everyone, maybe a couple E somethings. And I think particularly in the global south, where public transit is still supported by dirty second or third hand buses from the global north, I think we need to roll those out even faster than what we're doing in our own countries.
You know, that's a great point. You know, I've had the opportunity to deploy buses in Africa, Middle East, and I brought the first electric bus to Lima, Peru. And I've seen bus depots, garages, as we call them in North America, where they're dirt on the ground and mechanics are using drums to lift vehicles, to German bus garages where buses are going underground. So I've seen the full spectrum, and I completely agree. You know, congestion. You know, the argument made to private car owners in developed economies is around the fact that, look, you're creating environmental. When you take that equation out and they're adopting EV vehicles, that sort of guilt is not there. But we have to remember that their vehicles will occupy highway space, road space. So I completely agree with you, Rebecca. As someone in the transit industry for 15 years, we need the full modal shift. And you know, I think it was really good hearing about the battery swapping and that stuff, because, you know, I think there's no one size fits all solution here. Every market has a different approach and will create organically. I remember debating when I was in Africa a lot with the local operators around just sulfur content in diesel. And they were like, look, we want to go Euro 6, we want to go Euro 7, but our diesel is not clean enough to actually circulate that. And then, you know, we talked about electric, and they're like, well, the grid's down 7 times a day. So, you know, those are the realities on the ground. And, you know, I would love to hear more about India and how they're overcoming this.
Just a couple of very quick points from the technology angle that I was discussing earlier, but I wanted to also put a finance lens on this. So on the technology side, on the grid point you just made, the benefit of battery storage is that we have storage assets that are charging 24/7. So you don't need a fast charge. So you don't put stress on the grid. And that storage acts as stabilizing capacity. You could in fact sell that back to the grid if you want. So it stabilizes in emerging market context, the last mile problem. And just one more small point, that when we think of markets, and I completely agree with all of you, but you also have to sub-segment the market. So in Europe, the battery swap case, which creates a compelling TCO, is actually e-commerce delivery, because you can actually plan where it all works. So as opposed to private transportation. Shifting to the point Rebecca was making, I'm actually very passionate about the idea that it's highly eccentric for one, small human being to carry around tons of metal. And if you imagine India and all these countries doing that, we're cooked. So public transit has to be the core of what we do. Coming to buses, by the way, through this swap model, we've reduced a 3.5 ton for a 12-meter bus solution to a 650 kilogram battery swap. And the cost of the robotic infrastructure is a fraction of the cost of the saving of that battery. I don't need to spend too much time on that, but it completely changes the system cost. Turning to finance, the great, wonderful opportunity with bus mobilization, which is why I'm now spending all my time as a philanthropist on it, is that you can begin to replicate the renewable energy revolution, which was born on power purchase agreements through well-structured mobility purchase per kilometer, mobility as a service type contract structures. And those have been improving in the last 3 years dramatically. When that happens, you've got a huge new infrastructure asset category that can match the needs of pension funds and sovereign wealth funds who I work with to provide very large amounts of capital on massive shifts into a new asset category, infrastructure asset category. And that's really an immediate opportunity that many of us are working on. And I think there are going to be some interesting announcements in this COP today on this subject. And it's just very, very exciting. We could do tens of billions of dollars on bus electrification in the next few years. Thanks.
Some really great points from Rebecca and Uday there. And I think as you sort of lift your scan horizon away from passenger car and you start looking at the broader mass transportation sector, absolutely right. The one size fits all strategy doesn't work. So what you end up with is a small range of technologies that you try to spread across a broad range of different application requirements. And quite often you end up in a situation where you never actually satisfy any of them very well at all, because you've got a general performance that you're trying to put it out into the marketplace. So each of these market sectors, and transportation is one. If you look at aviation going up into the air, that's a different set of application requirements. Battery energy storage is again a different set of requirements. You need individual technology developments to be able to satisfy those market sectors properly and accurately. Otherwise, you end up with massive compromises, and that doesn't drive the value for anybody.
So can I add one more perspective, maybe to the developing countries' battery electric mobility? I think there is an additional very nice side effect potentially, because if people have batteries in vehicles like two-wheelers or cars and they're swappable, they can enable other business use cases, right? As we've seen with like solar pico systems, they do enable business to actually get off the ground where there wasn't power before, right? And you don't need much power to power a small business. So I think there is an additional like side benefit of, when it's done well, to get batteries and get electricity out in places where it hasn't been before. And that's actually quite exciting, right? Because it makes the economics better. It enables additional use cases. It just makes kind of the overall economic benefits higher. And I think that could also kind of just spark that and accelerate that transition.
That's a great point. Actually, in our next panel, we'll hear from someone deploying energy storage with bikes in courier first mile, last mile application. So, it's crazy. We have over 1 billion vehicles in the world, right? So there's, I think 7 people to a car or to a vehicle. So, just keep that in mind. I want to invite the audience. So I have a question. How many people here today are driving electric vehicles? Please raise your hand. Okay, so that's really good on this side. 2, that's phenomenal. And it depends on the household. Okay. Great. That's a great example. But my next question: who is going to their next vehicle? Is it going to be an electric vehicle? There we go. Yes, yours arriving Saturn. Yes. That's amazing.
Naeem, can I add a data point? Just very random and more narrative than a data point. So we did due diligence on one company and we did reference calls. We called like electrical installers in Germany. And they said 50% of the people buying and installing an EV charger at home don't even have the car yet, right? So that gives you a sense like what people are planning. And I think it has become mainstream.
That's amazing. Peter, I see.
I think that show of hands is really interesting because we do, like many people do, we do a load of surveys, and we do an e-mobility survey around the world. And that is one of the questions. You know, how likely is it that your next vehicle will be an electric vehicle? It's going like that. It's going like that. You know, the tipping point has come and gone. And I think one of the really interesting things that the OEMs, and I mean OEMs here in the broadest sense, regardless, not just the auto manufacturers, but OEMs generally, are going to have to face up to is I think there's going to be a shortage of batteries. And if you actually look at the data and you say, you look at all the battery producers and you go, well, hang on a minute, how are you going to procure all these batteries? And then if I was a battery producer, and clearly I'm on a panel with somebody who is a battery producer, I would be going, okay, what do I think about the security of my supply? What do I think about the security of my supply? Because you then go down the value chain. And I think that we could, I do emphasize the word could, I think we could be in an absolutely fascinating pivot where the consumer is saying, gimme, gimme, I've heard the message, gimme, gimme, I want an EV. And the sector, let's just call it as broad as that, is saying, ooh, we're really sorry, we're not sure we can supply them. I mean, you can see, all you've got to look at is, for those of us who do work in the automotive sector, all you need to look at is the disruption we're currently going through for semiconductors. And that shows, you know, if you don't have a part in a vehicle, the vehicle doesn't come off the production line. So I'm really encouraged by the fact that the consumers are saying, we've got it, we want EV. And I think there's an element of fleet mobility here as well, which we might touch on at some stage. I think corporates are looking at their fleets and saying, actually, our people are putting pressure on us to say we ought to have an electric fleet. We do a lot of work in that area. I know would do a lot of work in that area. But I really worry that there won't be enough supply.
It's a great point. You can just look to the US, to the Ford plants with all the F-150s parked. So one of the interesting things, and I think, you know, we all know Tesla. We know it's a pioneer, it's a leader. But there's a vehicle that I've been following very closely that I think is going to change and for the better electrification. Does anyone know the #1 selling vehicle in North America for the last 20 years? There we go. Yes, the F-150 Lightning, I think, is going to fundamentally change America's oil dependency. We've done many TCOs for public works departments, cities, city council fleets, which use F-150s. And we found that that opportunity to go electric is so phenomenal in their operations. It's not just about how you move the vehicle, but when you take it to site and you can use that battery storage to then power the hand tools that work on site, you're having secondary impacts. And, you know, I'm pretty sure, Matthias, you must know some companies that are out there that are going to lead that revolution. So just your thoughts in this space on what type of technologies have you seen that are going to enable from EV to personal behavior side?
Sure, I think there is a big point on how you charge and when you charge, right? Because as consumers become more aware, they also care about the CO2 content of the electric vehicles, because it's kind of pointless if you have an electric vehicle but you charge when there is 90% coal power on the national grid, right? So I think people become more aware and need technologies to kind of optimize for that specific data point, CO2. And then there's others. We see a lot of like innovators just electrifying things outside the transport, as you said, like on construction sites, right? There's diesel gensets that are even worse, like, or lawnmowers, those kind of things, which is like almost like very low hanging fruits if you think about it, right? Because you can, those are easier to electrify even than transport. So I think that convergence of mobility and other electric and battery electric use cases, that's very exciting to watch. And it could come from the same vehicle, right? Or like from a separate kind of device, but it'll be all in the same optimization towards the power grid. And so I think it's really convergent.
You know, it's a great example. So I don't know, in North America, every weekend we love cutting our grass. And in that process, we spill a lot of fuel. And it's very interesting that every weekend we cause over the course of a year are equivalent to the oil spills that we've seen over the last decade in the oceans. And it's the small things that Uday was talking about, the use cases. Where are they? And they're right in front of us. So I really look to you, the panel, to comment on where they're seeing opportunities in these use cases. Rebecca, then Uday.
Thanks. So it's funny you bring up lawnmowers and whatnot, because there's one household on my block that has an electric lawnmower. And every time I walk my dog past them and they're using it, I always make sure to stop and say, that's so cool, to really reinforce the benefits of their decision. And I chat with them about it. I'm like, oh, how long did you charge it? And it's always their son that's doing it. And so, I like to hope that by me stopping and saying how cool it is, he's the next generation of an EV buyer, and we're reinforcing those kind of smart decisions. But yes, so there's small segments of the market that obviously are compounding and lead up to this full electrification, at least from the ClimateWorks perspective. Because philanthropy is this small little sliver of funding within the broader financial architecture, we really try and deploy our resources and our energy on scalable, big impact projects, which means we don't do much on electric lawnmowers. We do a lot on trying to shift consumer behavior, on to shift government policies, and I already mentioned shift business leadership. So those are the areas where we really work hard to influence change, because we see those as the largest levers that we have at our disposal. But again, I think this conversation is focused on emerging economies in the global south. And I'll say it again, I think e-buses and 2- and 3-wheelers are our big play. And it's what's demanded by people who live in the global south. It's how they get to work already. It's how they drop their kids off already. It's how they go to their multiple jobs already. And I think it's unfair of us to just focus on the ZEV transition in our own countries. And we need to support the ability to leapfrog technologies in other countries as well, because again, we are in an age of recognizing that we need a just transition, and that we cannot have a future that leaves out over half of the world. And it really is something that, at least for me personally, I can't go to a job and just say, I'm just going to work on North American politics. I want to be working every day for those who don't have, to help clean up air quality and provide a bright future for folks all around the world.
The difficulty I think our generation has is to continue the ethical commitment to development of people's quality of life and earnings all over the world at the same time as we need massive decarbonization. This is not easy. I want to take an example, a case study from India to show how technology can bridge it. And forgive me, I'm going to go back to that battery swap. What I'd like you to imagine is the life of a rickshaw driver. Does everyone here know what a rickshaw is, or a tuk-tuk is? You all do? Great. So the Prime Minister Modi in my country did try and push electric rickshaws a few years ago. And that has been wonderful, because if you think about the world's 20 most polluted cities, my country has 14 of those cities. The WHO recommends that ppm 2.5 shouldn't be more than 25 parts per million. We're at 1,000 in this season now. Think about the lung cancer and the chronic lung disease created by all of this. So if you just hold that in your minds, what we are so excited about in our mission is we're hitting three things at the same time. The electrification shift of millions and millions of these rickshaw drivers, that's a shared mobility service, right, is hitting the climate change mitigation target on scale because of the transportation sector being so important. But it's also hitting the air pollution issue square on. And it's also raising the driver income of that particular driver. Let's just talk about the generations of innovation that are happening now. We have 2 million lead acid fixed rickshaws on the streets of northern India. The problem is these guys wake up at 7:30. Sorry, they're on the roads plying the early morning traffic by 7:30. They've got to go home at midday because their charge has run out. they plug in and they can only ply the evening traffic in a half charge from 5 to 7. It's not a disaster. They're catching the peak traffic, but they've deeply underutilized their vehicle. With swap, they swap with us once or twice a day. They're able to use that vehicle for 2 or 3 shifts, 16 to 18 hours. So the revenue, their brother, their cousin, their friend is running the vehicle. So now they are able to get a much higher income. And that matters when you're a poor person, because that extra saving is not used in your fixed costs. It goes to your child's education. So just bringing it down to a real case study. It also massively impacts e-commerce delivery assets, because now you can optimize. Amazon wants to do 16 to 18 hours a day, and suddenly that all changes. So that's just at the sort of southern level of just thinking about someone's life. I do want to say on use cases, and I'll just give the mic to you, Matthias, that what we've done on the finance side is to look at the big decarbonization opportunities, segment by segment. So we have 6 MTI, we call them mobility transition investment vehicles, 6 categories. So we look at municipal buses, mainly in Europe, but also in emerging countries, Colombia, India. We look at school buses, where the US is a fascinating case study. And you've got to think about utilization when the school bus is not running. We look at e-commerce delivery fleets. We look at ride-hailing app fleets. We look at long-distance trucking. And we look at the electrification for all of the above, not thinking about green hydrogen, which is a whole different stream. So we have looked at that, and we find huge opportunities for investment and finance right across that board today. There's not a single segment where it's not emerging and popping up. It's just a question of weaving together that ecosystem to make this highly investable. And that's happening fast. Sorry, I think Matthias, you were trying to get it.
Yeah, I kind of, more like a question, I guess, because my rickshaw experience is outdated, but at the time, like, people had to stop over every kilometer to buy more diesel, right? Because that's all the cash they had. They didn't have the cash for the full ride. And there might be an outdated experience, but I think that the point is there is need for financing. So people need to kind of have the financing to afford those kind of batteries in the swapping or whatever fashion, right? So, and I'm wondering if there is enough financing for those like small kind of businesses to get them the technology they need, right? Because they just can't afford upfront, or maybe not even a full charge. I don't know.
So I'll respond briefly because I know others should get in. But so with our battery swapping, we have 3 levels of data collection, communication inside the battery. So, and we've got digital twinning in the cloud. So we're getting data 24/7 from the usage pattern of that battery and that driver. That means that the data we can provide to the microcredit people is of a completely different nature to anything that's been seen before. Now you layer on AI and things like that, and the proposition you can offer the microfinancing industry is just a different level of security. The other thing is, because we are connected to that battery digitally, if anyone tries to steal that vehicle, we can just switch it off. And because it's a swap, they can't do anything about it. So it just changed, technology changes financeability in a fundamental sense.
I'm sure we're probably coming to a close soon, but I think that there's one thing that I think needs to be said, and the applications are really, really important. How we deliver that technology to people that are going to utilize it is really important. But I want to come swinging back to Peter's point, because he's absolutely right. There isn't enough battery capacity in the world. And that's not just because we're not throwing the gigafactories up quick enough. That is part of that picture. But it's looking at the upstream investment into the supply chain, the conversion processes, the mining and refining of the materials. Unfortunately, we have to mine these materials and we have to refine them. There's no other way around it. But batteries, I think we've heard today, are pretty much the major part of the bell curve in driving carbon out of our world. And if we can't deliver those batteries, then we're not talking about just, you know, the West increasing their electrification at an incredible rate and the OEMs adding in cycle plans, and we don't know where we're going to get the batteries from because they just keep piling it on top. And then we've got to think about global south. So if the West is consuming all of this energy storage capacity for electric vehicles and for, you know, for aviation in the future and battery energy storage, we've got to think about the emerging economies and making sure they get their fair share of access to battery technology. And the way it's going at the moment, unless there's an order of magnitude, in fact, maybe 2 orders of magnitude increase in investment in the supply chain and conversion processes and making sure that's decarbonized, we're not going to get to the quantum of batteries we need to be able to do this.
Thank you. I think that point about mining is really interesting because we are actually working with a mining company. We're underground. We're looking at electrifying their entire fleet. So it's almost like a full circle coming together. And on the surface, we're doing a large mine where we're looking at hydrogen vehicles. So, you know, I think, again, it's that example of there's no one size fits all solution. We have to look at the use cases and look at what fits them best. You know, I'm going to take this opportunity to invite any questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask a question, please. Sure. Tish, do you want to start?
Yeah, I guess one important piece that we haven't touched really yet is the recycling part of it, right? Because I think conceptually
that's the next panel.
Okay, good. So I'll save that. I think there's lots of stuff to be done on the recycling side of things for lithium-ion batteries.
No, I just wanted to say that obviously, as this lens is put on the supply chain, and we were talking about mining, it is clear that lots of companies are now looking at using renewable power in the mining process itself, in distributed solar and wind applications to make sure that is the case. And back to the lawnmower, obviously, we're now looking at electric vehicles for the mining equipment itself. So slowly that shift is happening on that part of the upstream. There are other issues involved as a transportation. And, you know, slowly everyone's doing it. It's a question of whether they're doing it at the same speed and the same time to make this all happen.
I think I can answer your question head on and directly, because you're right. You've got a green front end and you've got a greening back end in the mining sector. But the problem is, it's the middle bit, it's the conversion processes. So when you take those, you know, 999 refined materials and you need to convert them into the sulfates and into the precursor materials and into the cathode active materials, this is where the green energy really needs to be deployed, because just running the gigafactory off renewables and running the mine off renewables is not enough, because the embedded supply chain carbon is significantly more. So we have to get to that point very, very quickly. And this creates a fundamental problem, because most of these conversion processes happen in China at the moment. And we all know that environmental regulation and restrictions on industrial processes in China is far less stringent than it is in sort of Europe or in North America. So most of these materials loop through China with a very high carbon content on the energy grid. So it's very coal dominant. So we have to start reimagining those processes and making them more energy efficient. Number two, less polluting. And the reason the energy efficiency is really important is because we need to remove those processes from the Far East and repatriate them into the West, where we've got the battery facilities, or into places like India, as that capacity is stood up. But we've got to make sure that we don't insert industries that create more pollution than we have already, more CO2 emissions. So that means we've got to reimagine the manufacturing processes. We can't pick up the stuff that's being done in China and dump it in Europe or in South America or in North America, because it's far too polluting. That's where the effort and the investment really needs to go, to make sure that the middle part of the supply chain is decarbonized properly, so we don't just export our carbon problem somewhere else.
That's great. Let's hear from Peter on this perspective from a manufacturing side.
I mean, I think the question is bang on. Absolutely bang on. And I think the reality is I like Izzy's phrase, greenish. And it does depend candidly on where you are in the world. Let's not beat about the bush. It really does depend on where you are in the world. And I think it's part of the journey, unfortunately, because I think it would be too easy to say, this is all too difficult. Yes, you'll get a battery, but the amount of carbon in the battery production will be horrific. I think it's incumbent on all of us to continue to put pressure, either in our business roles or in our roles in society, to try and make sure those processes are getting better. But is it a challenge? Yes. And let's also, as we're having a very open discussion, let's not underestimate some of the human rights issues there as well. So unfortunately, some of the cobalt comes from pretty difficult places. And I think we have to be, as we're being now, as a group of people working in the sector, we have to be transparent about it. I don't think there's any point to say, no, it's not an issue. It is an issue. And I think that from and I'll now go parochial rather than global, from a UK perspective, we've got the opportunity to lead in this area in terms of making sure we're really clear, as you touched on it earlier, about where the materials have come from. What is the supply chain in the sector? But it's a great question, and I don't think we should brush it under the carpet.
You know, just on that point, that's great, Peter. I actually had the opportunity to visit 8 factories all over the world building buses for a client in North America, because the mayor was concerned that they didn't want the headline around cobalt and press. So they sent me to go around and look at these factories and to ask the difficult questions. And I remember sitting in a factory in China and asking them, and they were the first ones to produce a certificate that said that they were were not buying cobalt from any conflict zones, and they had this whole certificate. And I was like, when I went to my North American counter, they had to take me to 5 other rooms and find the head of supply chain and stuff. So it was really interesting, you know, that point that you're bringing about the ethical issues that we do need to think about. It's the environmental and the human rights, because I completely agree with you. We have an opportunity, a paradigm shift that everyone needs to come on board and move forward. And you know, there's so much positive energy, and last thing we need is to turn that into human rights challenges and stuff. And you know, I think that's a great point. We're seeing that in Canada with our Aboriginal land reserves that have huge reserves of precious metals there, that you know, we have to respect their process. And you know, there's an entire movement saying, let's get in there and let's just extract. And you know, you have to respect the process. Would you like to add?
The only thing I would say to your story, and I completely agree, we've got to diversify our supply chain. And thank you for mentioning India. But Modi's come up with this huge vision for manufacturing in India. But I do like the point you're making, because for us to get to where we need to get to, we do also need to engage in a constructive manner with the Chinese. And I fear that there's kind of this fracturing of the relationship happening right now. And we need to work with them in the way you suggested, to kind of make sure that the bits of the supply chain that are not working, you know, they're not the enemy of transformation. They want to also be competitive globally. So let's work in a cooperative fashion globally as one planet on all of this.
If I could just pick up on the cobalt topic. Unfortunately, a large proportion of the world's reserves of cobalt are in the DRC. It's a physical, geological fact. You can't get away from it. And there have been companies in the past that have said, we certify that we will not go and procure our cobalt from the DRC because of the artisanal mining problem, the child labour problem, the health and safety problems, and the traceability problems. Is that the correct answer? Is that the right ethical answer? Actually, I think not. And as a company, as Britishvolt, we think not. Because there's an opportunity that we will miss if we turn our backs. We will throw those people out of work. They will not be able to feed and educate their families and improve their lives. So let's work with the NGOs on the ground who are looking at improving the health and safety, stopping the child labour, and providing the information technology to provide the traceability so that we can trace these materials back to source. So let's lift all boats with this energy transition. Let's make a real difference to people that are struggling in life and have a very grim future, and let's try and improve that too. Let's work with the DRC and the operations there to make sure that we're getting the improvements we need. That, to me, is the ethical solution.
I could not agree more, and I think that's we cannot turn our backs. This is the looming specter within the EV transition is the fact that the supply chain is quite industrial and has a lot of negative externalities that we're currently not addressing adequately. But one thing that I do want to say is that this can be this is a perfect place to push on accountability for the OEMs. They can come and sit at the table and say, we're green, we're producing EVs. But if they're not also demanding from the supply chain that they're pulling from clean sources of those materials, then that's actually not coming to the table and being fully a part of a clean, green EV transition.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for your input today. And this panel has been excellent. We'll have our next panel starting at 10 a.m. So please join me in the round of claps.